Today, I want to talk about what might be called the silence of God. We who are believers live in the same world and see the same circumstances as unbelievers. And like unbelievers, we're troubled by the same evil in the world and by the same suffering in our own lives. And we too are often disappointed in Christians. And we're disappointed by the lack of spiritual progress in our own lives as well. But as believers, we believe in and bet our entire existence on this God we cannot see, touch, or prove scientifically. While unbelievers choose to bet their entire existence on the notion that such a God does not exist. That's what's at stake. And this week and next, I want to look at what you might call the silence of God. I want to tackle those areas that are the most troubling to people who would like to have faith, but find themselves struggling and asking questions we don't have all the answers for. There are many of them, but I'm going to distill them down to three biggies, three of the most common questions. And the first one is this: if believing in God is such a big deal to him, why doesn't God make himself more obvious? Right? Like, why doesn't God just part the clouds and write his name in the sky? Why not leave us more compelling proof and evidence? One of the most famous atheists of the last century was Bertrand Russell. And when he was 90 years old, he had an encounter with this woman at a party. And the woman said to him, "Mr. Russell, you're not only the world's most famous atheist, you're perhaps the world's oldest atheist. You will die soon. What will you do if after you die it turns out that God exists? What will you do if you come face to face with this God that you've defied your whole life long?" And Bertrand Russell responded to her that he would point his finger at God and say, "You, sir, gave us insufficient evidence." There was a time when I could kind of relate to that comment. But I now realize that God purposely presents himself to us in such a way that people who want to dismiss him will be able to dismiss him. He leaves space for them. People who don't want there to be a God can find a way to believe that there is no God. Another atheist philosopher, Norwood Russell Hanson, once said this: "I'm not a stubborn guy. I would become a theist, a believer, under some conditions. I'm open-minded." And then he lays out the conditions under which he would believe. Suppose next Tuesday, just after breakfast, all of us in this one world are knocked to our knees by a percussive and ear-shattering thunderclap. The sky is ablaze with an eerie silvery light, and just then, as all the people of this world look up, the heavens open, the clouds part, revealing an unbelievably radiant and immense Zeus-like figure, towering over the features of his Michelangelo face. And then he points down at me and explains for every man, woman, and child to hear, "I've had quite enough of your too clever logic chopping and word watching in matters of theology. Be ashamed, Norwood Russell Hanson. I do most certainly exist." Those are Hanson's conditions for becoming a believer in God. Now, think about that for a moment. If this were to happen, initially there would be a big shock. But as time passed and the shock wore off, as the memory faded, how do you think Hanson would respond to that moment? Really? I'll tell you what I think. I think probably over time he'd find a way to dismiss it as an hallucination or a strange dream or the result of a vivid imagination. Because people have been able to dismiss encounters with God since the beginning of time. The people of Israel experienced one miraculous encounter with God after another, but they would just forget or dismiss it over time and then wander away again in unbelief. Jesus, in fact, once told a story that proves that this is absolutely the case. In this story, Jesus said that if a person was not convinced of the reality of God by reading the scriptures, the Bible, then he wouldn't be convinced if a dead man came back to life right in front of him. Okay, let's read this story together. This is from Luke 16, 19 to 31. It's a little bit long, but hang with me here. Jesus, he told this parable. He said, there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. It says in hell, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. And so he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire. But Abraham replied, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us. He answered, Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them so that they will not also come to this place of torment. Abraham replied, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. Now, just so you know, that phrase, Moses and the prophets, was a reference to the Old Testament scriptures. It says, No, Father Abraham, he said, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent. He said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, the Bible of that day, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. Jesus said miracles won't do it. Miracles can be dismissed over time. You know, I've often thought that I wanted a miracle from God for confirmation, but then I remember this passage and I realized that all I really need is trust in His Word, which includes the accounts of hundreds of miracles. And part of what this gets to is a deeper issue. God's goal for the human race is not just to get people to admit that He exists. Let me say that again. God's goal for the human race is not just to get people to admit that He exists. See, God knows that forcing people to admit His existence doesn't really solve the core problem of the human race. Even if they admit that He exists, there's still the problem of the human heart. Let me illustrate this for you. Imagine you're driving down the road and you see a black and white squad car waiting on the side of the road. Honestly now, how many of you have ever found that your intention to obey the speed limit goes up when you see that car? Well, what happened in that moment when you saw the police car? Did you suddenly find that your heart changed in that moment and you realized that you love the existence of a speed limit? No. You're just doing a little pain avoidance. And if the officer stops you, and that's happened for just about everyone, right? You may even, in your secret heart of hearts, nurse bad thoughts about him. You may find yourself thinking, I don't deserve this. There are murderers and thieves out there. He ought to be chasing bad guys now instead of picking on an honest, tax-paying citizen like me. Or you may think, he's probably just after his quota. I mean, I know these guys. They have quotas. Some of you may even try to flirt with the officer or cry or act really sweet to avoid getting the ticket. People in my own marriage, not I, have actually done such a thing. Yeah, she hardly ever gets a ticket. Like, always a warning. Where's the justice in this world? But you see, what happens is our own darkness and self-preoccupation prevents us from seeing that officer of the law objectively for who he is. We project onto him our own fears and our own issues. And all of that colors the way we view that authority figure. Now, when it comes to God, you can multiply that 1,000 times over, right? And you begin to see part of God's problem in dealing with the human race, right? You're gonna figure this out, is that we will inevitably project our own fallenness onto God. So just getting people to believe in the existence of God isn't the real issue. People can believe in God, but still be moral or spiritual disasters. I mean, James put it like this: you believe that there's one God? Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. James 2:19. Now, do those demons believe what Jesus taught? That the one God is good and just and fair and loving? No, they don't at all. You see, for all of us, what goes on in our hearts colors our capacity to perceive any other being, right? So simply acknowledging that God exists doesn't solve the problem of the human heart. In fact, for people who don't want to believe in God and want to flee from God, it'll just make them secretly nurse the bitterness, the anger, the darkness more deeply in their hearts. It's part of why God says in Jeremiah 29:13, you will seek me and you will find me when you seek me with all your heart. What does it mean to seek God with all your heart? It means I seek him above all else. More than money, more than success, more than fame, more than pleasure. I want to know God. And he promises that if you do that, you'll find him. Of course, God is so good that he even reveals himself to people who search half-heartedly or people who aren't looking at all. But his promise is, if you seek me with all your heart, you will find me. So if you don't know God, you owe it to yourself and to God to seek him with all your heart. Okay, a second question that troubles folks sometimes is this: if Christianity is true, why aren't Christians better advertisements? Has that ever troubled you? Sometimes this objection will take a rather harsh form. Sam Harris, who wrote the book, The End of Faith, he argues that Christianity and religion pose the greatest threat of all to civilization and human survival. You know, that's become kind of a common argument since 9/11 and the emergence of the threat of terrorist attacks. And those who cite this objection will point to the Crusades, the Inquisition, the Salem witch trials, and so on. And they talk about how the Bible's been used historically to defend slavery or to defend the subjugation of women. One atheist, Stephen Weinberg, put it like this: good people do good things and bad people do bad things, but to get good people to do bad things, that takes religion. Well, I think the place to start here is to acknowledge that many horrible things have been done in the name of God, including the name of the God of the Bible. And as Christians, we ought to look at those episodes, those errors openly and honestly and humbly and not get defensive. You know, some people who have an historical axe to grind may exaggerate it or distort it. But to the extent that believers are guilty of wrongdoing, they'll be held accountable. I mean, 1 Peter 4:17 says, judgment begins in the household of God. But I think we also have to ask, were these events, these horrible atrocities, were they the outcome of Jesus' teachings? Really? I mean, the Jesus who said, love your enemies. The Jesus who said, bless those who persecute you. The Jesus who said, when somebody hits you, turn the other cheek. The Jesus who said on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Were things like the Crusades or the Inquisition the outcome of Jesus' teachings? Or were they actually the contradiction of his teachings? You also, I think, have to ask the question, has the human race done better in societies that seek to eliminate faith altogether? Like, has that experiment worked better? You have to acknowledge the fact that the greatest bloodbaths in the history of the human race have been recorded in the 20th century in countries that sought to eliminate God, worship, and faith. Stalin, He's thought to have been responsible for 20 million deaths. Mikhail Gorbachev put that estimate actually closer to 35 million. A recent book said that Mao Zedong alone in China was responsible for around 70 million deaths. Hitler in Nazi Germany was responsible for somewhere close to 10 million deaths. And then you look at despots like Pol Pot in Cambodia. That's an atheist regime where 20% of the population of an entire country was massacred by a leader who said he had no accountability to God. I think that evil on an international scale, terrorism, oppression, and so on, exists not because of religious faith or differences. It exists because of the darkness that resides in every human heart. Human depravity, our sin nature. Jeremiah 17:9 says, our hearts are deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Think about it. I mean, remove all religion. No worship, no churches, no God, no faith, no belief in the afterlife. Would that remove the bulk of the darkness from the human heart? Yeah, I'm not seeing that. Now, I have more to say about this topic, but we're running out of time here on this week's podcast. And so let's just pick up the question. If Christianity is true, why aren't Christians better advertisements next week on Tipping Sacred Cows? Hope you join us for that episode. Have a great week.